Hi, everyone, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Nike Guys podcast. I'm your host, Sid, and I'm joined by my co host, Pat and Doug. Tonight, Douglas will be doing a presentation for us.
Yeah, so tonight I'm going to be talking about one of the more famous and controversial psychological experiments. It's called the Milgram experiment. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, I'm just going to break it down and go over what happened. And you guys feel free to jump in with any questions, anything that's unclear. So the Milgram experiment was done by Stanley Milgram, who was a psychologist at Yale University. Happened in, I think, 1961, um, or at least the one we're going to be talking about today. There were like 18 different variations of it over 10 years, but this is the most infamous one, the most common one. And it was in 1961. Basically started with an ad in the paper that said, "We will pay 500 men to help complete a scientific study of memory and learning. Each person who participated would get paid $4 plus 50 cents car fare." So I'm not sure what that translates to with inflation today, but I think it was a decent amount of money for back then. So the volunteers would go to Yale University and would meet another person whom they thought was also another random volunteer. But he was actually an actor who was in on the experiment and knew what was going on. And they would draw straws for who would be the teacher and who would be the learner. Now, the volunteer thought this was all random chance, but it was rigged so that the actor who was in on the experiment was the one who would be the learner. So basically, the teacher, the volunteer, would be uh, taken into a room along with one of the experimenters there at the facility, um, in a white lab coat, would take him into would take him first into the room where the learner, the paid actor, would be, and show him being strapped into an electric chair, and then would take the volunteer, the teacher, into another room adjacent to that with just a very thin wall, so they couldn't see each other, but they could hear each other. Now, the teacher was told that he was participating in an experiment of basically the effect of negative reinforcement or punishment on learning. So he was seated in front of a electrical shock generator type of device with a row of switches ranging from 15 volts, which is labeled light shock, all the way to 450 volts, which was labeled severe shock.
Wow, that's cooking, brother. That
Yeah,
will
that's
fire you up.
potentially lethal or lethal voltage. And the teacher would begin asking the person on the other side of the wall questions, just an arbitrary quiz. I think it was some type of word pair quiz. The paid actor on the other side of the wall would intentionally answer some questions wrong. And then the teacher would be instructed to administer a shock with progressively increasing shocks. Um, and so the paid actor is not actually getting shocked. But remember that the volunteer actually believes that he's delivering electric shocks to a random stranger. So they would go through the test, and the paid actor would, grunt or maybe even groan a little bit, or as the shocks got worse, start yelling, start pounding on the wall, saying, "I have a heart disease, get me out of here." And obviously, if you were the person administering those shocks, you think that he's getting shocked for real. You don't know that he's a paid actor. And obviously that's concerning to anybody who's not a psychopath. And so they would, you know, talk to the person running the experiment, the lab coat, be like, "Hey, like, I'm hurting this man, like I can't do this anymore." And the experimenter, the person overseeing the experiment, had a list of scripted prompts that they would use when the people protested. The first prompt was, "Please continue." Okay, so they continue and they say, "No, I can't do this anymore. I'm hurting this man." And then the experimenter would say, "The experiment requires that you continue." Okay, so you continue, and You say, no, I can't do this. This is too far. I'm going to kill him. And the experimenter says, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And then finally, the last prompt was, you have no other choice. You must go on. So these were scripted prompts that they were given. Um, and if the teacher continued to protest after the fourth prompt, the experiment would be stopped. Otherwise, it would go all the way to max voltage,
Which is 600 volts, right?
450.
Oh, 450.
450. Now, if you've never heard of this experiment or the results of this experiment, take a minute to think about how many of these people do you think would shock this person up to 450 volts, potentially lethal voltage? And how many of them do you think would at some point refuse and say, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. This is wrong. In other words, how many people would kill a random stranger because an authority figure, a perceived authority figure told them to do so?
I have a question. So,
Yes, go ahead.
was there any did the person who was being experimented on, the one being told to administer the shocks, were they told that the person being tested that they were supposedly shocking had a way to, stop if they wanted, or they believed that this person had no way to escape?
No, they were told that these shocks would be painful, but would not do harm, supposedly. And they were not. There was no way of escape, as far as we know, that they thought the person had.
Okay. But they were
So,
told they
like,
would be non-lethal shocks.
I mean, they were strapped into this electric chair, and so yeah,
but you said they could not see the person that was supposedly being shocked, or
no,
they
they
could see.
couldn't see
Okay.
him. They
But
could
they
hear.
could hear him.
They could
Okay.
hear him
Okay.
over the thin wall. You think about that, and
Okay, but I am correct that it was non-lethal, supposedly.
450 volts. If that was
Well,
actually
450 volts is non-lethal at 0 amps.
well,
It's like
yeah,
it's like an
I,
electronic shocking fence is, 7 to 12,000 volts or something,
yeah,
depending on brand.
yeah. No, it depends. But these switches were marked. See, the average person probably doesn't know anything about what voltage is lethal. So these switches were marked progressively from light shock to danger, extreme shock. So they knew that this last voltage was extremely dangerous. And often when they went to high enough voltages, the person on the other side of the wall would stop responding altogether. And obviously, that's
Cue a faint puff of smoke from the other room.
obviously that's quite scary because you don't know, like, if they stop responding, that's bad. And but the experimenter would say, if they're not responding, treat that as a wrong answer and continue shocking them.
That's just
Okay,
brutal. Like, no answer is wrong. That's pretty
that's
next.
rough.
So
I believe before this experiment was done, this question was asked to a group of psychology students, and their conclusion was that 1 in 1,000 participants would go all the way to the max voltage of 450 volts. In reality, 65% or two-thirds of the volunteers went all the way to 450 volts because they were told to, essentially.
do we know, like, the person, the supposed authority figure, do we know if they were, like, physically imposing? Because, like, I'm wondering, like, if you had a little old lady in a lab coat telling you to do this versus some, like, hulking giant of a gym rat, would there be a difference there?
I don't know that, but I'm guessing they paid attention to it because, like, the room these people were in was, like, small and dark. It was in, like, the basement of the university, so they were paying attention to the vibe for sure. So I'm guessing they used the tallest guy they had. An important thing is they were wearing a lab coat because that gives them perceived authority, which is quite interesting.
Like Dr. Fauci.
Yeah, essentially.
I guess the biggest thing to me, if I was in that scenario, is does the scientist who's giving me these orders know if the other person can be harmed or not? Because I mean, if they're willing, if they have a way to tap out or something, and it's non-lethal, I'll zap them for however much they can take, right? But if I'm led to believe that I could potentially harm them, that's a different story.
Right, yeah, I think the person that you're shocking is pretty much at your mercy because, they show you the process of strapping him in to the electric chair. So I think they were pretty much led to believe that this person is gonna get shocked as much as you decide to shock them.
Okay, interesting.
Other question is, you said this was like the first of like maybe 18 sort of experiments like this, or was this not the first? Are we talking about one that's just like
I'm
around?
not sure if it was the first one, but it's by far the most, I don't know how you'd say, it's the most popular variation of it. I'll say it that way. Um, I believe he did multiple others, but they were either mostly the same or same concept at least.
Interesting.
Which obviously today, an experiment like this is considered completely unethical and terrible and would never be approved.
Which is honestly really sad. Like a lot of psychological experiments that happened in like the 60s, 70s, even the 50s, whatever. We can't even do them again today to see if like anything changed about people because they're
Right.
unethical. And I'm like, psychology might be somewhat unethical, but how are you supposed to get data if you just don't do it?
Well, it depends on the experiment if you go around and, like, drug people with LSD without them knowing it versus if they volunteer and it's relatively safe.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, but one of the big problems with this experiment is in psychological experimentation, nowadays it's considered wrong or malpractice or whatever to not inform someone of what you're actually testing for, which a lot of these experiments depend on the fact that you don't know what you're being tested for, that you're being lied to. And also some of them involve like you can't test minors anymore, which is I guess sad. I don't really know. I mean, that sort of makes sense, but also how you supposed to know how people are, how minors react psychologically if you can't test them anymore?
Yeah. So this experiment was considered unethical, like you said, because they were deceived about it. And obviously nobody was physically harmed, but there was emotional and psychological distress to the volunteers. Um, and so that's the main thing that's considered unethical today.
Okay, but were they debriefed after the experiment?
Kind of conflicting accounts on that. Some people say, oh, they weren't properly debriefed. Some people say, like Stanley Milgram wrote a whole book about it, and I think in his book he would say, we debriefed them. They were aware. They left there knowing that they did not actually hurt anybody.
Wake-up call for them.
Yeah, although maybe it wasn't because a lot of them testified afterward and said they didn't actually really feel responsible for what they did to the person. And it's this thing called diffusion of responsibility, where because a perceived authority figure told them to do it, they feel like the responsibility shifts from them to the shoulders of the person telling them to do that.
Kinda
We
like
see
Pilate
this,
washing his hands.
yeah, basically. Although he's the authority figure, but
Right, in that scenario.
social pressure, yeah.
So, are we saying that the Nazis really were just following orders?
So that is actually what motivated this experiment. Stanley Milgram was a Jew. He was born in 1933, which I think is when the Third Reich basically began. The Nazis came to power, and his some of his close family escaped the Holocaust. So that was what motivated this, was because the Nuremberg trials happened. The the Nazi soldiers said we were just following orders, and so that's called diffusion of responsibility, and we see that in like the My Lai massacre, which Pat you're probably familiar with,
Yeah.
where the lieutenant basically um let me get my facts straight. A massacre in the Vietnam War where U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, and the lieutenant, afterward testifying, same thing. He was just obeying orders from higher up.
Now, to be fair, in that scenario, they were dropped off in the village and told that the whole area had been cleared of civilians and everybody they saw was going to be a militant. Now, obviously, when you're shooting women and children, you know that those probably aren't militants at that point, but like they went into the village expecting that they're only going to find militants, and yeah, things went
Gotcha.
south very
Gotcha.
fast.
So yeah, this whole diffusion of responsibility thing seems like maybe some of the participants afterward were not actually as emotionally scarred from this as some people today think they would have been, because they don't feel responsibility for that. And I'm not sure, because you still ultimately have free will. So you still, like, nobody can take your free will away from you. So you're still responsible for whatever you do, no matter who's telling you to do it.
Right,
I
I feel like
mean,
there was a large enough percentage of, like, you didn't understand, you didn't know all the dynamics of the situation to enough that it's like if you're new at a job and somebody tells you, "Go operate this," say, piece of equipment, and you know it could potentially harm somebody if you do it wrong, but apparently because you were told by somebody in authority to do it, it's apparently safe, right? Now, if you're properly safety trained, you know that that's the wrong thing to do and that you have to be properly trained on whatever you're doing before you can do it. But I feel like it makes it hard to determine what was going on in these people's minds just because they didn't know for sure. Like they weren't told, oh, 450 volts will kill this person or
Well,
whatever.
that was the point. That was the point of the labels on the machine. The labels on the machine were labeled that, like, this voltage is extremely dangerous. So I think that was the point of that, was to make sure they knew that this, maybe while it might not kill somebody, it's very dangerous. And this person that's strapped in the electric chair is, there's old footage of these experiments where the person getting strapped in the electric chair is like, how bad are these shocks going to be? He's an actor, obviously, but he's like, how bad are these shocks going to be? Like, my doctor said I have a heart condition, I can't take much of this. So I think
Interesting.
a lot of these people were aware that they could cause a lot of harm to somebody.
and still, you said 65% went the whole way up?
65% went all the way to 450 volts. The rest of them all went to at least 300.
Really?
Yeah,
That takes away your faith in humanity pretty fast.
it could, yes.
So literally nobody said, I'm just not doing this and stopped before 300.
Yeah, nobody. So if you would have protested 4 times, they would have used, the teacher or the experimenter would have used up their 4th prompt on you. After that, they had instructions to let you off. So if you would have been
So
persistent and said,
five
"No, I'm not gonna do
times.
this," what was that?
So 5 times, right?
Or 5
Like,
times, yeah.
the 5th time, they would have just
The
said,
5th
"You
time,
don't
they
need
would
to."
have let you go. They had instructions to let you go after the 5th time. So, yeah, you were not, like, a lot of people say this is also unethical because it seemed like these volunteers were coerced into doing this, or were forced or whatever. And maybe there's a level to that as well, but if they would have continued protesting, they would have been released from it.
Takes I said, "Let him cook" to a whole new level when you're flipping electric switches on a chair, you know?
100%. So, if this ties in with, like, the whole Nazi thing of just following orders, are most massacres in history you think that way? Like, do you think we could classify, let's say, 60% of massacres and genocides in that way? That, like, most of the people involved were just following orders, and they felt somewhat coerced, you might say, into doing the slaughtering because someone in authority told them to.
Well, that's a bold stand. I don't think it's 60%. Like, okay, I can see the Nazis if you were, say, working in a concentration camp or something. Um, like, it's really bad to oppose the Nazi regime, especially the SS, because they were just ruthless, you know, they'd kill you, whatever. And I think that was pretty obvious to some of those people, but if you look at some other genocides of, you know, just Vietnamese villages or whatever it was, I don't think it I think it was different. I think there it was soldiers who were just fed up with the war, fed up with whatever's going on, and they just, you know, they're done with it and they're just bloodthirsty or they're out of their minds, they're shell shocked, whatever, and they're not right anymore. Or they're psychopathic. But I think a lot of it is just the psychological effects of warfare to some of them. Some people are just psychopathic. They
Was just doing a quick little AI search here. Apparently, some estimates indicate that about 50% of the German population was aware of the atrocities being committed against Jews or other groups. Now, that doesn't mean, I mean, it's obviously you only need like what, like maybe 3% of the population to commit a Holocaust, like to actually help out with it in some way. Mm,
I
But
disagree with AI. They may have been aware that there was some things happening, but I don't think they knew the full extent of what we've been told today.
no, they definitely didn't know that much.
Like Like, okay, yeah, you might I mean, the Americans rounded up Japanese and put them in labor camps or whatever during World War II. Like, how many people know that?
Well, it was like the opposite of a labor camp. It was like a sitting camp. But yeah, like
Okay,
it
fine,
was
whatever
just
they
like a
did with them.
jail. Like you
The
just sit
point is
there.
you don't know what's happening, but the military comes and takes XYZ% of the civilians who are this demographic because they say that they're a threat to the country, right?
Yeah,
And and what are you gonna do about that? Go start a mob like they're doing in Los Angeles or whatever?
I guess I don't know. I mean, you're right. I guess no one, or I don't know of.
I would argue they didn't know what was going on in those camps, and I'm sure there was some who did, but you also have to remember the Nazis had great propaganda machine, they did a really good job at mind washing people.
It's true.
If you were raised from, 10 on up hearing that whatever, Hitler's great and Jews are bad or whatever the propaganda was back then, and you're now, 20, 25, whatever. Um, I don't know. Probably believe it.
So the other part of this was um, the thing of gradual escalation. So there's this book called Ordinary Men about how um, basically average German men were trained over time to commit horrible atrocities in World War II. And that's also a point of a sort of similar concept called the Lucifer effect. A point of the Lucifer effect is that transformation from good to evil occurs gradually with small incremental steps. And that's what they did here with the shock generator. It started at 15 volts, and then I think it was 15-volt increments all the way up to 450. So it was a gradual escalation, and I think that definitely affects how far people are willing to go.
Sure, because it's like, what's another 15 volts gonna do that the other one didn't, right?
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm trying to think. Do I agree that? Yeah, I guess it was gradual for like the German people. Like, oh, Jews are bad because they're like the bankers or whatever, and they're taking your money. And then eventually it's like, okay, they're just enemies of the state. And then eventually it's like, exterminate them all.
Yeah,
So,
which that book, Ordinary Men, was about, let me see, Reserve Police Battalion 101, which was a specific unit.
interesting.
And the book Ordinary Men is about the training process of that unit specifically, not necessarily the German people in general, although it could apply as well.
Well, you may also remember the Germans recruited, like, 13 and 14-year-olds because they were the least conscientious and the most easy to train to do whatever horrendous act.
Yeah,
Like, they have
that's,
very low what is it, like, 14 to 16-year-olds or something. It doesn't bother them to shed blood or whatever.
I think it's actually lower than that. I think it's more like 11 to 14 or something is like
Or
the
whatever, there's
ideal
some
age.
very young age gap where they're yeah, if you can catch them then and train them ever after that, it doesn't affect them the same. And I think that I would argue that that's some of the reason like school shootings happen and things is these kids are playing video games, they're watching violent movies all their lives. They see it being glorified, being a fun thing, being exciting, whatever. And then they're like, let's just, play a little GTA and then let's go play this for real, man. Go shoot up a school and they don't actually regret it because to them it was fun. Their brains are messed up.
That could be, though. There is some studies that come out and supposedly prove that there's literally no link between like violent video games and actual violence. Then again, you know what they say about studies. If
Well, yeah, who funds the studies? That might be a great question.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Rockstar Gaming with how many 100 million or billion-dollar budget for GTA 6 and we still don't have it. Sure you could throw in a little money for studies that say that these games don't mess kids up when they clearly do.
well, you know what they say about studies. If the results are surprising, like if the results aren't common sense, then it's false. And then eventually studies will come around and then if the results are not surprising, then it just proves common sense like 50 years later. And so there's no point in the studies anyway.
Sure. So what we're saying is we should have our own study.
Yes, yes, that's definitely what we're saying.
Okay, I'm down.
So I have another kind of random question. The vast majority of the participants in this study, the volunteers, were men. And so my question is, if it was mostly women, would the results have been different? And why?
Yes, I'm going with a yes on this one because women are provably more empathic than men are.
Mhm.
So I think
Okay.
they feel a bit more sympathy for the person beyond the wall.
But
I f
th-
I feel like there would have been a greater split in the differences. I feel like Patrick's right to some degree, but I think another thing that plays in is women and liberal people will disagree with me probably, but women are somewhat more submissive than men and
that was going to be
less,
my counterpoint.
I can't say the word right now, but less, like, forceful and self-willed and strong-willed and things. And so I think you would have those women who are, I know women who just couldn't harm a flea type thing. Um, and then there's women who just, if you tell them to do something, they're more likely to do it than a guy is just because they're too scared to stand up, right? Or they're not too scared, but they're just naturally built that way. So I think you would see a big split. You'd probably have people who would stop long before 300 volts, I think, and then some people, and then the ones who do go all the way up would do it with less. They probably wouldn't need to ask 4 times if they have to. I don't know, though. I guess we can rerun the experiment. Where to find 500 women that don't know about it, though, I don't know.
Well, I have this feeling that this is completely me making this up right now, but I'm willing to bet that more guys know about this experiment than girls.
That sounds about right.
These guys are just nerdy psychopaths, right?
Yeah, basically.
Sure.
But also, like I was saying about all the prohibitions nowadays against experiments like that, you basically have to do like beast games or something to get properly gut-wrenching psychological experiments anymore.
Yeah, but, I mean, can't I surely there's paperwork that just make them all sign legal contracts.
Well, see,
It's not like as long as you're not funded by somebody, you're not held to somebody else's set of
yeah, that's
rules,
the thing.
besides the government
If we were
rules.
working independent of a university, because all studies at a university are run through like these rigorous boards of ethics and things. So, but if you were doing an independent study, there'd be a chance.
But at that point, would anybody accept your study because you're not a
Right,
verified
that's the
group?
thing then. Then it would just be for personal interest, and you may have a harder time getting people to sign up for it, and you'd have a hard time getting your results accepted in the scientific community.
Yeah, but I think as long as you document your process, you would be fine. Yes, you're not a reputable source necessarily, but if you have well-documented processes and experiments, you can't argue with the results, right?
Well, you can't argue with the results, man, but like scientific journals won't publish you, obviously, because you're not a research
Yeah, sure.
paper.
But scientific journals are overrated because now we have this cool thing called the internet.
Well, but it comes back to this thing of perception of authority. If people don't perceive you as an authority on the subject, if you don't have the letters behind your name, they're not going to accept it. And the media uses this tactic all the time. This thing of bringing in the experts and the people with the titles and the letters behind their name and stuff, and people are quicker to believe those people because they perceive them as an authority or an expert.
Yeah, that's fair. So I don't
Yeah.
think the point of the experiment was trying to make everyone believe in the results. I was just curious what would happen.
Oh, it'd 100% be interesting to do. Now, also, you said this happened at Stanford?
Yeah.
It happened at Yale. Okay. Just trying to figure out because Stanford did some interesting psychological experiments back in the day, too.
Yeah, the prison experiment was,
That's great. We should maybe cover that sometime.
yeah, we should. Some of that ties into this, I suppose.
But again, I think that was exclusively male, though.
Yeah.
That was 100% male. There wasn't any females in that one, which maybe means that they're all conspiring to never be in psychological experiments that guys truly can never actually figure women out.
We've uncovered the conspiracy.
Oh, wait, what was this thought? I didn't quite catch it.
Basically, what I was arguing is that women never submit themselves to psychological experimentation like guys do because they never want us to actually figure them out.
That's fair. Yeah, I hate how true this sounds.
So, in my research about this topic, I came across an interview with a former official at the CIA, and he said that the average person can be talked into murdering a random stranger in about an hour. Yeah.
Whoa, hold
The
on.
average person can be talked into murdering a random stranger in about an hour. And the three factors are perception, context, and permission. And you can see all three of these at work in the Milgram experiment. The perception was that this person telling me to give these shocks is an authority and knows what I need to do. The context was specifically an unfamiliar context is quite powerful for people. The context was a building I've never been in before, a basement of this, big building, and it's dark, and a small building. And permission was, this person is telling me to do it. It's not my responsibility anymore because this person who I perceive as an authority figure gave me permission. And so those are the three factors, um, essentially, that can be used and probably have been used to talk people into doing horrible things.
That location thing is true, at least for me, like, I'm more likely to listen to supposed authority figures if you're in an unfamiliar location, because it's like, I don't have the information in this area, they supposedly do.
Right.
Or is what we're saying that insecurity is humans' biggest downfall, maybe? Or is the reason
Well,
they're
maybe not insecurity as much as a shifting of focus, because if you're in an unfamiliar um, location or environment, your focus is going to be at least partially or at least subconsciously directed to that location, right? Because we tend to focus on things that are new and that are unfamiliar.
Well, it's almost like we're distracted or overloaded by the fact that we're trying to take in all this data on the new location.
Yeah, that says it well. That was the CIA operative who gave this statistic. Um, that was essentially his thesis on that.
That sort of makes sense. But again, that's like an awfully disturbing statistic if true. Now, of course, it is a CIA operative, and we know how much we trust those. But
That is true.
then
Yeah,
again,
but I
if
don't
you
think they're wrong.
That's the thing. I mean, you can argue with the statistic and say, well, maybe, maybe it takes longer than an hour, or maybe, you know, whatever. But the point is, we know that human nature is this way, and people can be convinced to do horrible things because it's happened in history, and then it's happened in, things like the Milgram experiment or the Stanford prison experiment that we brought up.
and then again, if you ever watched like I really watched an interview that like probably scared me more than any other interview I'd watched. They were interviewing, I believe, an SAS, British Special Forces psychological operative almost. Like his job was a lot of training on psychologically breaking recruits. And that guy is just scary. Like, I don't know, sometimes you can just see a person and the way they talk and the way they're just completely confident and that they can make you do anything in a little bit of no time, like this guy said. And it's just like, okay, game's over probably.
I think we see I think we see this fact or the principles here that we're looking at have been extorted all over history. Looking at, say, the Catholic Church back in the 1300s or whenever, and back in the Dark Ages and things, the Middle Ages, when there was very little education and things, they were believed to be the smartest, the most educated, and they held that over everybody, and that's why everybody just put up with the stupidity that they did. And I think that's still why to this very day, even modern Americans will put up with the ridiculous things the government says and does, just because they're sheeple, they're scared, man. They haven't been taught to think for themselves. They haven't been taught that it's okay to use your own logic in a scenario, and if your logic says that what the government or authority figure is telling you is wrong, then it might actually be wrong, and you should seriously question it. Like, I don't know, man. It's so true. You see it.
Yeah, Sid brought up a good point there about how put yourself in a Milgram experiment situation or even a Nazi Germany situation, and how would you avoid um, doing horrible things because people tell you to? And Sid kind of mentioned in passing, critical thinking is important. Hopefully, you also have a moral code that's based in the Bible, and hopefully, your ethics aren't just based on what you've been taught, and you've actually figured out for yourself what moral and immoral behavior is. And like I said, critical thinking is super important. Teach yourself how to analyze things and figure out what's true, what's false, who can you trust and who can you not trust.
Yeah, you just can't be scared to stand up, man. It's one of the scariest things for people. Like the statistic, I don't know if it's accurate or not, is that more than 50% of people rank fear of public speaking as higher than fear of death. Like, they were more scared to speak publicly than to die. Now, I'm sure if you walked up to them with a gun and said, "Here, you're going to speak publicly or I'm gonna kill you," that statistic would suddenly change in their mind, and they would decide to do the public speaking. But people are just scared, man.
Well, I will throw in one thing, not exactly a counterpoint. Well, it is sort of, I guess. But especially when you're speaking out against a government or like the entire culture, people will sacrifice a lot. They will give away a lot of freedoms, a lot of their money, a lot of anything to keep an intact society, which may be the correct trade-off. Like there's a lot of questions you can have there because if society collapses, well then where are you? But like people will give up a lot of their control, hand it over to the government, and allow the CCP or whoever to tell them what to do because it leads to a very orderly and very efficient society.
I
So you're
think that thing
saying
is
can you explain this in, like, with using an example, say, Iran, right? Um, which I know this isn't our news episode or whatever, but, like, the people there are being called on to rebel based on news reports I've seen, and I don't know if they are or not, but, you're saying what? In theory, they will be willing to watch all this bad stuff happening and not give up and still follow the dictatorship just because they don't want to lose what life they do have and the way their lives are?
Do you have something to say, Doug?
I was gonna say along with your point of people wanting an orderly society, that's part of it, at least in most cases, but the other thing is, um, simply the need or the desire to be accepted in that society, um, because another thing in that, Ordinary Men book was the part of that regiment, they were doing progressively more evil and more horrible things, and they were told that at any time they could back out, but they didn't because they felt it would be betraying the rest of the members of that team. And so I think that thing of feeling like you're part of this society, and if you go against what's being said, you're no longer part of that society is also powerful.
Yes, that definitely is. But into Sid's point about Iran, it's sort of the theory of like if you were in Iran right now and you decided to rebel and try to overthrow the regime, it's probably not going to make your life better. Like legitimately, it's probably going to descend into civil war. And like, do you want to be Syria or Lebanon or any other country like that? Like, it may be legitimately worth more to be underneath the rule of whatever religious fanatic there is, because at least there is rule, and at least there is law and order, and at least the banks work. You know, some things like that, people are very loath to give up with good reason. It's sort of Jordan Peterson's point about Exodus, where in Exodus, you can have a rebellion, you can leave Egypt, you can get rid of the Pharaoh, but where does that put you? Immediately you go into the desert and you don't get to the promised land the next day. That's only through a lot of hard work.
So I think my counterpoint is like I would argue that it's not so much people are scared of losing what they have right now as it is fear of the unknown and fear of missing out. So a little bit of it is FOMO, right? Like where you're talking about like the Nazi party and or whatever, and like if they quit, then they're betraying their group, right? So that's some of it, but I think the biggest thing is fear of the unknown. People are scared. They're scared about what they don't know.
And you're saying that fear would keep these people in Iran from actually rising up and forcing a regime change or
Yeah, so if you force a regime change, what's gonna happen? And it's not just those people, it's the people in this experiment. It's the Nazis, it's whoever. If you would say, "No, I'm not gonna do it," what's gonna happen? Is the person gonna just shock you next? Like, they're clearly not afraid to do what it takes to make this experiment happen, right? They don't seem worried about the fact that you're shocking somebody. So what are they gonna do to you if you don't listen? I mean, you could offer me a 6 figures a year kind of job, but I have to move to a part of the world that I've never been and know 0 people in, and I'd probably turn you down. Why? I like what I have. It's not perfect, but, I can't complain, and it's scary to do that. Like, I think fear really drives people way more than they ever realize.
yeah, probably. And so to actually do something like since we're using this example of Iran, fear is keeping these people back from attempting a regime change. So in order to attempt that, they would have to believe that the results are going to be positive and are going to be better than simply continuing in their current state.
Yes.
Yeah. Requires big faith in yourself and in your
Yeah, faith
ability to survive
faith in yourself and faith
in the
in
community.
the results of your actions.
Sure. And I think people though have respect for it. Like if you hear about people who the live free or die saying type thing, right? Like say the Americans who stood up against the British rulers and said, I would rather fight and die to have freedom than live under this, right? Or the Christians, who were persecuted. They said, I'm happy to die because I'm dying free, right? I could live under that or I can die free, and they'd rather die free. And I think a lot of people actually can respect that because it really says something. They're fearless, man.
Yes, they are fearless, but in a way, they're actually more afraid of what happens if they continue with the status quo than if they overthrow it. For a rebellion to happen, there has to be a greater fear driving them than the fear of instability and absolute chaos.
Yeah. Yeah. But if you have a very low fear of what happens if you overthrow said regime or whatever the question is, then it doesn't take a lot of fear of, or you may just be tired of what's continuing to happen, right? It's just most people will pick the evil they know instead of the evil they don't.
To to bring this back maybe a little bit closer to home, basically what I'm sort of hinting at is that you have to let the your fears drive you, or otherwise you're going to be driven by external fears that may drive you to do things other people want. Like if you can control your fear enough to be like, I see a issue here, I see a rising danger here. To avoid it, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and then you continue. You almost feed that fear, but not exactly. So that you continue doing X, Y, Z, so that it never happens. Is maybe what I'm getting at. Be a good strategy.
Hey, well, thanks, Doug, for the presentation. It's really fascinating, psychology and all that. It'd be great to keep on talking, but probably should kind of wrap this thing up.
All right, yep. We're going to have to wrap our discussion of this fascinating experiment. As you can see, it's a bit of a exploration of the darker side of human nature, but I believe it's important that we understand some things about ourselves like that. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. You can find the Nuggy Guys podcast on YouTube, Amazon Music, and Spotify. And if you enjoyed this, feel free to rate us 5 stars, share with a friend.
And as always, guys, be careful out there.